Hey everyone, I'm Peter Barron. Welcome to today's episode of the Moonshot Podcast. I'm really excited to be joined by Bridget Johnson. She is the founder of the Dean's Roundtable. I've gotten to know her work. The thing that, Bridget, I'm just going to do a little side here.
No, it's
LinkedIn has
fine.
been just amazing in terms of connecting me with lots of different people. And
Same.
you and I connected there. I'm fascinated by your work in terms of supporting professionals who are on the student life side of the house. And we're going to dig into that, do some connections back over to the business model, and have a really interesting conversation. But before we do that, Bridget Johnson, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Peter. Really appreciate it. I echo your sentiments in terms of LinkedIn and connections. I've really had some very positive experiences there. I'm so excited to be able to chat with you today.
Oh, that's great. And before we do that, I'd love to know a little bit more about yourself and certainly like set up Dean's Roundtable, the work that you do there.
Absolutely. So I started Dean's Roundtable back in 2012 with a couple other colleagues of mine, just because, as a dean, I was a dean at the time at a school in outside of Boston, and it just felt like there was not a lot out there to supporting specifically deans of students. And at the time, I was a new dean, and I was wondering to myself, like, is this role hard or is it me? It's hard. And looking for some community, some networking, some support out there, really, just kind of the idea just kind of blossomed. And like I said, I reached out to a couple other folks and we decided to put on our first conference in 2012, in the summertime, just a way to connect and network. And it kind of grew from there. It really has been a labor of love for me. I've really enjoyed the connections I've made with other student life professionals and the speakers that we bring through every year. And it's just been a wonderful experience to be able to help support deans in the work that they do. And so what the Dean's Roundtable does now, in addition to the conference that we run every summer. We have a podcast that we're now starting. I think I've recorded about 6, but we've got about 3 that are live now. We have blog posts, but what I'm really most excited about is the new online community that we have. And so trying to kind of foster those connections and networking throughout the school year. So this online community is a place for deans to connect, learn, and share. They can share things that they are working on or having troubles with. They can share resources, vendors, but also connect with other deans that are doing the work that they do, and so they know that they're not on an island, they're not alone. So I'm pretty
Yeah,
excited about that.
I love that. The community obviously is central to the work that I do, and I love how you're doing the same for student life professionals. But let's talk about the unique role of a student life professional and the role that they play in independent schools. And I know when we've talked before, their contributions are sometimes overlooked. I'd love to like dig into that.
Absolutely. And so, deans are the bridge to all constituencies on campus. Parents, students, staff, administrators, board. That's the one person that usually has their hand in a little bit of everything. And they're working behind the scenes hard. And so what I like to kind of equate it to is that, you see that duck skating across the pond, but they look like there's nothing happening. They're just smooth sailing across the surface, but underneath they're furiously working. And that's what I like in the role of a dean in any school. First of all, the role is so varied. Every school is a little bit different, right? And so their roles and responsibilities, it's hard to sometimes pinpoint them all. And for that reason alone makes the job inherently difficult.
What are some of those challenges? Like what makes it difficult? And if you're not a student life professional, maybe you're head of school, right? And
Mhm.
you've got a talented person in that role. How can they how can a head in particular, so this is a two-part question. So how,
Okay.
like what are some of the challenges and how can a head better support folks who are doing this work?
Well, there are lots of challenges that deans face on a regular basis. And I'm going to kind of go through a couple of those and then we can come back and discuss them in a little bit more detail. But the emotional labor that, a dean has to output on a regular basis, they're managing conflicts and crises and behavioral issues, it's challenging. The emotional toll can lead to burnout. High visibility, low recognition. So the dean is everywhere. But the only time they're really recognized or, someone like, has something to say is when, there's a problem, right? Or something's going wrong. And so while they're always around and always doing the work, they generally go unnoticed. Complex problem solving, always having to solve multiple problems, whether it has to deal with student conflict, student adult conflict, always having to problem solve, and time pressure. And they have to do these things fairly quickly. Everyone wants an answer immediately, right? We live in that microwave society where everyone wants an answer right now. You want to do the thing now, solve my problem now. And then boundary management. And so that's become increasingly more difficult, in my opinion, in these days where you have to be both a disciplinarian, but also a mentor, but also while maintaining professional boundaries. So lots of things that they're dealing with on a daily basis that sometimes people think are just kind of easy to do and just kind of go unnoticed.
Yeah. So very complex, right? Like I love that. Like what did you said that they're, typically unnoticed until they're noticed, which in some cases is like not the situation that you necessarily want to be in because they're dealing with really challenging things. How can a head then support them better? Like how, specifically around empathy, like what can they do to build empathy for that role? Especially if a head didn't do that job before.
Right. And so, regular communication and check in. It's important to know kind of what's going on. I mean, I imagine that lots of head of schools are busy kind of doing external thing, and it's only when kind of major disciplinary issues come up that they're checking in with their deans or having conversations. But I would, suggest that you have a regularly standing meeting time with your dean, once a month, just to check in and see how things are going, how they're doing. And oftentimes they need just a place where they can kind of vent, for lack of a better term, or debrief on things that have happened previously. And I don't think people take debriefing seriously enough. I think it's really important for schools to kind of look at, all right, if we had a big decision, whether it's discipline or whatever, that has gone down, how did it go? What's the aftermath? What are the follow-ups that need to happen? How are we feeling about what's happening on campus now? Because the other thing that we haven't really talked about is that deans are really responsible for creating the culture or setting the tone for the culture on campus. And so if you have a situation that you had that was really difficult on campus that you had to manage and you don't debrief about that, are you learning from what happened? Are you changing policy? Are you doing things differently? Or are we just kind of operating on the fly? Which you don't want to do. So definitely regular check-ins, providing professional development is super important, creating a support network for that group, but also recognizing their contributions. Deans very rarely get a pat on the back, right? It's often like, oh, I can't believe you had to make that decision, or I don't agree with that decision. And, we oftentimes try and make everyone happy, but you know you can't make everyone happy, right? And so making sure that you pat your dean on the back every now and then and recognize their contributions is really important. Another thing that's important is empowering their voice, making sure that, the decisions or things that are coming out of the dean's office that you're standing behind. Or if your dean needs you to make a decision top down that will help them in the work that they're doing, that you're doing that as well. Modeling empathy, checking in with them, again, making sure that you are letting them know that you're there for them and that that the work that they're doing is difficult and empathize with them in that way. And making sure they have enough staffing and resources to do the work that they need to do is important because as the landscape has changed and the needs have grown, I don't know if we have scaled those offices to support that work that they need to do. And then lastly, and probably most importantly, is to encourage wellness. We don't do that enough as well. These folks are working all the time, and it sometimes feels like you can't kind of take a break or catch your breath, making sure that they are taking time for themselves.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you about burnout. I mean, what is the state of like burnout for deans right now?
I think the role of dean has become increasingly difficult. I mean, certainly more difficult since I've been a dean. I mean, social media, I mean, we just had, Facebook and Snapchat to deal with. I mean, all the things that people are having to deal with now, you really just can't escape it. And you can't say you can't use it, right? That's not a viable solution. And so managing those pieces, but also managing the stress and the mental health around that and the really damaging things that can happen from that has really been hard. And, we take the recent political conflicts and the election and all of this, all those things are piling up. And I did a podcast on civil discourse and how that's become increasingly difficult. And just having people be kind to each other, managing that stuff on a daily basis takes a toll. And so I do feel like, and I don't have any, particular numbers on this, that people are tapping out and like, I'm good. I don't want to do this anymore. It's too much.
Yeah, it just seems like there's a lot of, I don't know if burden's the right word, but, certainly there's just a lot of emotional challenges that you have to
Emotional
deal with.
challenges. I
Uh,
think that's a great term to use.
so structurally, like, how can a school support folks structurally in order for them to do their work well and maybe try to, like, turn the dial back on the burnout if you can?
I think that's a great question. So investing in programming, I think is really important. You need to make sure that you're creating a culture, you're creating setting standards on campus that helps the dean to do their job a bit better. I would also say, in terms of, parent interaction and setting the standards there and making sure, again, about civil discourse and how we engage, super important, but also just again, kind of empowering the dean to be able to make decisions that you're going to stand behind, I think is also something that you want to make sure that you're doing.
Yeah, how can deans do the preemptive work so that they're not necessarily, in a conflict situation? Instead, they're, maybe diffusing conflict well in advance before it ever appears?
Well, I mentioned before about creating culture, and creating a positive school culture goes a long way in helping kind of mitigate some of that stuff. And so, how you start your year is really important, and what messages you send to the students and faculty alike about how we're going to operate. And doing that work early, that's the beginning of school is a hard time, right? We all know, we've been in those schools, and the opening of a school programming is it's vast and can feel like I cannot put another thing on my plate. But the culture piece is super important. You want to start your school year on the right note. And once the toothpaste out the tube, you can't put it back in, right? And so doing that work early and talking about how we're going to engage with each other, what the standards are, and being consistent with that is where the bread and butter lies in terms of a positive school culture.
What are what are some things that you've seen that have worked?
So I think a couple of things work. One, like I said, setting the tone early is important, but also who you're engaging with on campus. It can't just be the dean up there saying these things. You need to be partnering with other folks on campus, whether it's your counseling department, your student leaders, your activities people. Everyone needs to be on the same page about what we're trying to achieve here and speaking the same language. Because if it's just the dean up there, it's not going to work. And so that's super important to kind of cross collaborate.
Yeah. As we've been talking here, like it's just very clear how a dean is working with virtually every constituent group at the school, right? And they're just highly woven into the culture and in fact, setting culture and
Yep,
working to set culture.
absolutely.
So, from the perspective of my work, which is iterating the business model, creating value, being able to, sustain enrollment, all the things, right?
Mhm.
It strikes me that like the dean is just incredibly important to the value prop, especially when it comes to enrollment and retention. I mean, I just imagine like a lot of the word of mouth stuff emanates out of the work that the dean is doing.
Absolutely.
Am I reading that right?
You are reading that 100% correct because, again, like I said, creating that culture and what the people or what students say about their experience at the school, how they engage once they are done. Both, you've got your current constituents and then your alumni. And so you want to make sure that all those people are saying positive things about the school because that's retention, but that's also, building your admissions pool and pipeline. So you want to make sure that people come into your school saying, this is a school where I learned, I grew a lot, I was challenged in the right ways, I was held to a certain standard. It's a positive place to be. And so the dean of students has a lot to do with that. If people feel like their voice wasn't heard or feel like they weren't treated fairly, that gets out too. And so people are like, I don't know if that's a school I want to send my child to. Or you've got alumni saying, I wouldn't send my child there. And that's not what you want kind of ruminating out there in those circles.
Yeah. What kind of professional development can you provide for student life professionals? Like, I mean, obviously that's your work, right? So you do that regularly, but how should schools be prioritizing that? I'm curious.
That's another great question, Peter. And I think sometimes what happens with student life professionals, they rise to the ranks of the school and they oh, this person's great with working with kids. Let's put them in this leadership position without kind of the training and the foundation that they may need or may not have had prior to being in this role. So definitely some leadership and management training is important because now you've got groups of people that are looking to you as their leader. And so you want to make sure that you are shored up there in terms of leading the adults that you manage on your team. I would also say, I'm getting my master's in restorative practices, and that's been something that has definitely informed the work that I do now and wish I would have had that as a dean. So, anytime that you can have your deans do some work in restorative practices, I think it helps the entire community. Diversity, equity, inclusion training is also super important. You want to make sure that you are kind of looking at the work through that lens and making sure that you're being equitable in all the decisions that you're making. Crisis management, I can't talk about that enough. I mean, Dean of Students is the front line for discipline, but also other crises that happen on campus. And so you want to make sure that they have had some training in that area. Peer mentoring and networking is also important because you're not just, I hope, not just doling out discipline, right? There are layers to what you're doing, and we're creating culture, we're creating a positive community, but also that also takes work in terms of building relationships. And so that's where you start first, with anything. The foundation for any of these, whether it's the programming or the culture setting, is building relationships. And so if you haven't had a lot of work or training in kind of what the tenets are to be able to do that, you're going to need some work in that area as well. And so, but also, trauma informed practice is important. You've got people coming from lots of different places who've had lots of different experiences, and to be able to make sure that you are providing the support that those folks need, and not kind of assuming how people should or what they need is super important.
I've been doing a lot of work with this, aspiring leaders. So maybe you're an assistant director of something and you want to
Uh,
be a director of something or
yep.
future head of school. Not all paths will run through the dean's office, right? Like not all
Right.
aspiring leaders, but like all the things you just listed are things that any aspiring leader, especially if you want to be a head of school, like you need to get some training in all those different areas. How can an aspiring leader who doesn't sit in the dean's office partner with the dean to start to build some of those skills if they do want to be ahead, and understanding that that's really important to know crisis management and the equity inclusion work and the restorative practices, all the things, like how can they is that does that make sense that they can think about it in terms of a partnership, or I'm just curious.
I do think so, and I think the best way to kind of get that training is oftentimes just kind of on the job, right? And so being a part of those conversations, I remember what was extremely helpful for me is being a part of the administrative team and being a part of those meetings where we talked about crisis management in particular, because also the dean has a lens that maybe some of the other folks don't have in terms of the inner workings of the school, and like actually that's actually not a good idea to do that because that doesn't make sense in terms of kind of the life of the school, the community of school, and what we do here, or it doesn't fit with our schedule, right? Some very practical things. And so being a part of those conversations and being in the room oftentimes is where a lot of learning and growth happens. So I would encourage school leaders to have their dean of students as a part of their leadership team.
How often is that the norm, or is that not the norm?
It's been, when I first started as a dean, I was a part of those leadership circles, and then there was a kind of a little bit of a split where division heads would kind of take over kind of the inner workings of the school, and the head of school would be more external. And so there was kind of a split there as to whether or not, or who was, the dean was speaking to or reporting to on a regular basis. I think people are taking a hybrid approach now because they do realize the importance of having the voice of student life in those conversations so that the head of school can speak intelligently when they are speaking externally.
What does a hybrid approach look like?
I think a hybrid approach is they may not necessarily be on the in the leadership circle anymore, but still having direct contact with the head of school, like a monthly meeting, just to kind of check in and make sure that they are on the same page and just kind of know what's going on. Again, that connection and empathy piece.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Hey, just a couple more questions as we start to wrap up. I'm curious, all the things that you just make a very compelling case why schools need to invest in this, in the work that you're doing. So how can schools just strategically invest in student life so that they're really kind of it's aligned with that broader business model and driving measurable impact?
I think there's a couple of things that they can do. Making sure that the school is aligning programs with their mission and goals is super important, and making sure that everyone's on the same page about that. Data-driven decision making, I think sometimes we lose sight of that a little bit. And looking back at a course of a school year and look at the decisions that were made and how they impacted the school and what the numbers are associated with that. And again, that kind of feedback or debriefing on how those things kind of affect the school are super important, and how you inform your decisions moving forward, and not just deciding on making a policy change or something because you feel like it's the right thing to do. Have some data to support that. Talk to constituents on campus, talk to your students, talk to the faculty, make sure that you're making an informed decision that way. You could also focus on some signature programs. If there are leadership retreats or service learning trips or kind of mental health initiatives that can be kind of signature to your school, you might want to think about doing something like that. Integrating student life into your admissions and marketing, because the dean of student life, right? The dean of students is kind of all encompassing when it comes to what's happening on campus, and making sure that that voice is heard in your admissions and marketing material. Leveraging technology is also important. There's so many things out there that can help us to kind of enhance the work that we're doing. There's a huge conversation around AI right now and how we should be using it. And so kind of lean into that, definitely. I think all those things would be helpful.
Okay, last question. I always love to end with some version of this. So let's put your consulting hat on for a second.
Okay.
And if a school, let's say a school reached out to you and said, Bridget, we need to support our student life professionals better,
Hmm.
but we're not sure where to start. What would be some of the initial things that you would recommend?
Absolutely. A great question. I think the first thing is to have a conversation with your dean, see how they're doing, see where they are. And outside of like conducting a needs assessment, just really just connecting first and making sure that those lines of communication are open, making sure that you've clarified roles and responsibilities. You will be surprised at how many times I've heard people say, "Well, I'm not sure exactly what my role is or where I fit in here." And so making sure those things are clear and that everyone has the same marching orders is super important. I said this earlier, but opening the lines of communication, letting them know that, I'm here. Let's set up a regularly scheduled meeting time so that I can touch base with you, so I can understand and know what's going on. And in that same vein, say, what can I do right now immediately? Is there an immediate pain point that I can help you with? And providing some immediate support in that area, I think would be helpful. And then also, investing professional development. See what they need, see what they've had and had not had, and making sure that you're getting the support that they need in that area. And then think about how you can develop some long term solutions if there are things that are happening on campus that you're not generally happy with. Taking some time, retreats are wonderful, and they're helpful to kind of think about and problem solve and troubleshoot when there's not a crisis. I mean, you can fly the plane while you're driving it, but it's not the best thing to do. You want to make sure that in times where there's not something particularly high intensity going on, that you have a moment to say, all right, what are the things that we want to work on? Or how can we better prepare ourselves? Or what sort of things should we be thinking about, and not do those things in the moment?
Yeah, it gets back to that debriefing, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Bridget Johnson, founder of Dean's Roundtable. I said a second ago that that was my last question, but I do have one more.
Absolutely.
How can people get a hold of you?
So you can reach me at Bridget at deansroundtable.org. Our website is deansroundtable.org. I'm on LinkedIn. Love to connect with all of you. Happy to help in any way that I can.
Bridget Johnson, again, founder of Dean's Roundtable. Thanks. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's been a blast.